Good afternoon and welcome to you all. We all use math every day. Today I'm with Drake Eshelman. Drake is a DV alumnus from 2016. He's been involved with a music program, both with orchestra, playing the viola, and chorus. He took many STEM classes. He was a captain of our scholastic pole team and a big member of FBLA. He went on to Cornell University, majored in music, and graduated magna cum laude just days ago in 2020. So, Drake, welcome.
Thanks, Mr. D, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I think it's really cool that you're doing this, and I love that this is all about how we all use math every day. You know, anyone who's taken a class with Mr. Divizia knows that's a phrase you're going to hear 20, 30, 40 times throughout the course of a semester. And I personally remember you bringing back alumni to do these sort of talks. And so I'm really just honored that I get to be here and talk to people about some of the stuff I'm doing.
You know, I'm thrilled to have you here. It kind of comes full circle now, doesn't it? So
yeah, a little bit.
You're that person now, Drake. Awesome. So let's take you back to when you were a DV student, first of all, to let the students connect and kind of see your pathway that got you to what you're talking about today.
Yeah.
What is it about your experience at DV that led you to where you are today right now?
Yeah. So as a DV student, I was pretty sure essentially through my entire middle and high school career, I wanted to do math. Math was going to be the end-all be-all thing that I studied in college and hopefully became a math professor. And if you listen to Mr. Divizia's intro, you know there's a twist ending to that. So I was, generally I was super interested in math, and so I took all the math classes that I could, and I, joined the math team, and I was just, interested in all that. But my family has always been pretty musical. Both my sisters were musicians, and both of them are also artists in their own right. And so I was always encouraged to explore other things. So I was a dancer. I did ballet for 11 years while I was in grade school. As you said, I was in the orchestra, I played viola, I was in the choir, and I always competed in the kind of honor choir system. And I also just generally tried to take all the opportunities that high school gave to me. So that was joining clubs like FBLA and Scholastic Bowl, taking classes that I didn't think that I wouldn't consider part of like my core, being. One of the standouts was AP Art History. It was a very small class that Dr. Lance taught, and I just remember thinking to myself, if I hadn't, taken this step in another direction and taken this class, then I would be missing a huge part of what I like, which is, I'm an art nerd now. So ultimately, if we're talking about what led me here today, right now, kind of coming off of college, I'm, split between a couple of different options of what I want to do in terms of applying my music degree. But one of the things I've done is I've done composition for a couple of different companies, specifically for game music, actually, for video games. And a lot of my inspiration for that came from a lot of my, anyone who's in the orchestra knows that there's a composition assignment that we've done every year, at least I hope there still is. And, I remember looking back, I still look back to those assignments that I did those 4 years in high school, and I see that I took those as an opportunity, not just to, do an assignment and, get a grade on it, but to use this rare opportunity I had to use this good notation software and actually write something that I liked. And I look back to those as like kind of my earliest memories of composing music on my own and all of that, and getting interested in those things. I don't know how well I answered this question, Mr. D.
I think you did a great job with it. Actually, let me follow that up a little bit, because one thing that's kind of unique to you is that you did so many different diverse things at Delaware Valley. And I think this is actually kind of a neat plug for our school too, because one of the things that I think as a faculty member at Delaware Valley, we've always been proud of the fact that for the size of our school, we offer an incredible diversity of extracurricular activities that students can be involved in, classes that they can take, and ways they can explore their interests. And I don't know a lot of people that have explored the wide range of all of them, I think, like you have. So that was you, as I remember you, at in your high school years. But now let's take that a step forward. So now you come out of Delaware Valley and you go into Cornell, and it's kind of an interesting story. I know some about, of course, what you went in to major in, how things developed, that sort of thing. So as you began life as a Cornell student, how did DV impact, I guess, the way you explored all of the wide range of interests you had available to you?
Yeah. So, I tried my best to kind of, have a hand in almost everything that was going on in DV. And, I think I did an okay job about that. I think I had my artistic and musical stuff. I had my academic things that I was really into. I played a sport for a little bit. I felt like I was able to do quite a lot at DV. And once you get to a school like Cornell, where there's 10,000 student groups and whatever, you kind of have to start choosing what's valuable to you and finding new things. So the first things that I did at Cornell were I signed up for a choir audition, and I got into the choir that I've been in for 4 years now, the Cornell Glee Club. And once I got into the Glee Club, I learned that, a cappella is a thing at this campus. And I was like, I've never done that. I've never sung popular music. Let's try it. So I auditioned for the subset a cappella group for my choir, and I got in, and I ended up being in that for 4 years. I ended up directing that group for a year. And I was doing all this under the pretenses that I was going to major in math. So my first year, I only took one math class. I took linear algebra, and I did fine. And I took 3 other classes, one of which was an art history class that I loved, one of which was a class about the history of food in Japan, which I loved. And the last one was introductory to Italian, which I loved. And I was like, it's crazy that I can take all of these different classes that are entirely new to me. And I mean, even linear algebra was entirely new to me. And make a way for I'm feeling like I'm learning in all these different, areas again. It felt like Quiz Bowl. It felt like I was kind of, putting a hand in everything. Going into my second semester at Cornell, that was when I took the dreaded multivariable calculus. And I'll say to all math students here, don't underestimate multivariable calculus. It is harder than regular calculus. And don't be like me. I underestimated multivariable calculus, and it kicked my butt. And I didn't get the grade that I needed to apply for the math major. And, this was my kind of first reality. This was my first moment where I was like, I'm working hard on these things, but maybe it's not all going to be easy. Essentially, I got this really bad grade in multivariable. And my multivariable tutor, who was a friend of mine my year, who had taken some multivariable calculus before for some reason, he was like, hey, I know you write music, and I know you're really into video games. I am starting a video game company next year. I'm taking a year off of school to do this. Do you want to write music for my games? And I was like, of course I do. And I sent him... he gave me an example of what one of the games was like, and I sent him something back in like 2 days. I was like really, really inspired by this, and they loved it. And so for the next year, I ended up working. I went to California that summer to work for this startup doing educational VR games, which is just, very odd and very interesting to do virtual reality music. And I worked for them for the summer, and then they kept me on for the entire year. And at some point between when he asked me, hey, do you want to write this, and when I came back to Cornell in the fall, I was like, I love math. I'm always going to love math, but I think I really have a chance here with music. I think this is something I shouldn't let go. And so coming back to Cornell, I was like, okay, I'm going to take a lot of the music major classes, see if I can apply for the major. And all the classes I took, I loved. And I essentially rode that wave until now. And I actually just last month, actually a month and a half ago now, finished an honors thesis, and I wrote 70 pages and 3 compositions, and the thesis was about how video game music and how the process of making video game music affects composition, specifically dynamic video game music, and how music changes throughout the course of the game. And so it started from just this small little niche hobby that I had, where I really liked writing music, and I liked writing music specifically for games because that's the music I liked listening to growing up, because I played a lot of video games. And it turned into both a career and a research topic for what I might be doing in grad school if I go.
Yeah. Drake, in what you're saying, there's kind of an underlying message, I think, that should really speak to some of our high school students right now. And you may remember back then, maybe it affected you differently, but high school students, a lot of times as they start to get near the end of their high school career, even as we speak right now, we have seniors getting ready to graduate, maybe a different form of graduation, but still graduate and move on and start a new life. But there's this pressure of, okay, what now? And needing to know like some kind of direction, what they're going to go in and do and that sort of thing. And yet you have kind of at that point, early into your time at Cornell, now have kind of had this sinewy path that kind of went through so many different things. What do you say to a student now who might be a senior or maybe junior and feeling the pressure of having to know what is it you want to do with your life? What would you say to them?
Some people leaving high school are very, very, very confident about what they're going to do. I was one of those people, and I was just super wrong. And I think the moral of that story is that you have no idea what's coming, but if you keep an eye out for opportunities and realize that the people you meet, not just for the next 4 years, but for the rest of your life, are going to be the people who present opportunities to you. And the fact that if you have this fixed idea of what you are going to be in your head, if you follow that path and then turns out you're not happy with that path, it's best to be prepared to be flexible. And ultimately, that's the kind of philosophy that I took starting at the end of my freshman year of college, is that I'd rather be flexible and happy with all of my decisions than be beholden to what I thought in my senior year of high school. Because I'm a very different person and I know a lot more than I did in the senior year of high school. So if you're worried about changing, making a big change, realize if you feel like it's right for you, you know way better than you a year ago did. You know so much more. You've experienced so much more. You've talked to so many more people. Just always be willing to check in with yourself and say, like, am I really satisfied with what I'm doing right now?
Yeah. Yeah. Great guy. We got a question from the audience that I want to bring up at this point because I think it applies here. So Kayla Courtwright asked, which games have you worked on? And if you are allowed to talk about them, could you name some games like that?
I can, and you won't recognize any of them. But so I worked for a company called Diver EDU, which stands for Digital Integrated Virtual Reality Education. Got it. And so I worked on about 10 to 12 games for them. Essentially what they did is they made a bunch of short, like 10 to 15 minute virtual reality experiences and games that were meant to accompany high school science lectures. So the idea is you'd learn about for example, the immune system in class, and then you would play a little game where you play a white blood cell in a bloodstream trying to protect the bloodstream from viruses. Anything like that. There were about 10 to 15 games that they made, and I wrote music for all of them. And then they also did a couple of other more commercial games. The biggest one was called Curio Pets. It was kind of like a Pokemon Go knockoff. I think I'm allowed to say that. And that game was on the Play Store for a little bit, and then ended up getting taken down. But I wrote all the music for all those games. So I wrote probably about an hour to an hour 15 of worth of music over the course of a year for them. And so you can find these games, you can find videos of these games. I don't know if they're still available for download, but if you're interested and have they're all mobile games, so you can play them even if you don't have a VR headset or whatever. But yeah.
Okay. All right. Great. So of course, this is We All Use Math Every Day. And so now what we've learned is that you kind of veered sort of away from that and now majoring in music at Cornell at that point. So my question is, how has math had an impact on your study of music? Is math completely out of the picture for you, or does it still influence the way you think about music somehow?
So I've always been a big fan of music theory. Music theory is essentially the tools that musicians use to look at a piece of music and understand how it works. And a lot of music theory doesn't necessarily involve too much math. Some of it is purely descriptive, and some of it is purely, qualitative in the way that you describe things. But a lot of it is very, very mathy. And there's a series of messages that I sent to Mr. Divizia this last semester, because I was in a class called Post-Tonal Music Theory. And I'm going to try to avoid a lot of the kind of complications of it, but just to explain a couple of the concepts that we use in that class. Those of you who are familiar with the kind of Western music system, or if you've ever just seen a piano, there are 12 notes. There are 12 pitches that the Western music system uses. And after, on a piano, after you hit the 12th note, it just repeats. And so you have a C, and you go all the way up to B, and then go up to C again. And I realized that I should probably have said A all the way up to G, and then G sharp, and then A again. So there's 12 pitches, and almost all of music, these pitches have been arranged in what we know as keys. Essentially, there are certain pitches that are more important. So if I'm in the key of D major, the note D is like the most important note. The note G sharp doesn't matter as much. And this can also be applied to chords as well. So some people around the turn of the century, 1900s, started thinking, well, what if we stopped caring about that? What if we treated every note as if it was equal? And we kind of used randomness or some sort of mathematical process to determine what notes get played. Now, first of all, if you listen to this music, it will sound very odd and alien, and honestly, probably pretty bad to most of you. So we're used to hearing music in keys. And what these composers wanted to do was kind of break away from that tradition. And if, let's say, we assign a number to each of these 12 pitches, so we can start at 0, because people like counting starting at 0, and we go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 11. Once you get past 11, you just go to 0 again. And there's a type of mathematics called modulo arithmetic that is very, very useful for describing situations like this. It's used a lot in mathematics for things like figuring out divisibility and anything that really kind of has this repeating pattern. But in music, it allows us to describe certain things that we normally would just describe with words with math. So if I have a chord, if I have a C major chord in this sort of notation, it's going to be 0, 4, and 7. which would normally be C, E, and G.
Mhm.
And if I want to do something to that chord, let's say I want to transpose it up, I just add the same number to each of these. So if I want to transpose it up a major fifth, or not a perfect fifth, what am I talking about? Then I just have to add 7 to each of these. So 0, 4, 7 turns into 7, 11, and then 14, but 14 doesn't really work here because we're past 12. So what we have to do is subtract 12 from 14, and then we get a 2, which is going to be the right note. And so essentially what modular arithmetic does is it allows us to describe the way that chords and notes and clusters of pitches interact in a way that makes sense within this 12-note framework. And then you can do other fun things like inverting things. So instead of going 0, 0, 4, 7, I could go the opposite direction. So instead of up 4 and then up 3, I'm going to go down 4 and down 3. And that gives me, if you do the modular arithmetic, 0, 8, 3, which is going to be a completely different. Oh, wait, no, I got that wrong. It's going to be 0, 0, 8, and then, oh, wow, my math. 0, 8, 5, which is going to be a different chord, and essentially you flipped it along the axis. And then there's a bunch of very interesting transformations, really in-depth stuff that we can do to these to describe and construct interesting musical pieces. Another interesting one, anyone who has taken any of Mr. Divisia's classes knows about Pascal's triangle, and Pascal's triangle actually shows up in this sort of music as well. Because there is this one thing called inclusion theory in post-tonal music. And this is, I'm giving you the watered down version because this is a senior level music class. But the gist of it is, let's say I have a collection of 6 pitches. Let's call it 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. That's what's called the whole tone scale. And I want to see how many different chords of 3 notes I can make out of those 6 pitches. Well, we have a pretty easy way to do that if we use combinatorics. And even better than that, if we just go to a certain, if we just go to the 6th row of the Pascal triangle, we can find out how many chords of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 notes we can make out of this 6-note set. And that gives composers a really nice tool to say, here are your possible harmonic options given this constraint. And so we use Pascal's triangle in my class to figure out how to construct these chords based off of these sets of notes. And these things, there's many, many other ways that these things have popped up in this sort of class.
Yeah. Wow. What a great answer. I think
I tried my best.
I love hearing in what you're saying is that I'm sure everybody listening heard the same thing as I did. You're talking music, not so much math. You're talking music. But in the process of talking about music, you can't help but be talking about the math that you understand. And sometimes I like to say to people how mathematics is kind of like this lens through which you experience the world. Mm-hmm. And it's like, it's much more joyful existence to understand the world through the lens of mathematics than not knowing that. So that was really cool. In fact, actually, that brings us nicely to where I really, really want to go. I think you know where I want to go with this, because you have talked with me about the golden ratio. Yeah. And anyone who's had me for honors geometry certainly has heard me talk about phi, the golden ratio. Mm-hmm. But what's neat about it is that while this ratio shows up in so many different disciplines that we don't understand why it shows up, mm-hmm. you are vitally interested in its appearance in music.
Yeah.
I want you, if you could talk about how does this golden ratio appear in music, and do we know even why?
Yeah. So one thing that's really interesting, first of all, if we're using this number system, let's say instead of counting with 0, we're starting to count with 1. Actually, no, wait, one second. Yeah. So if we're starting to count with 1, and we go and we look at the major scale, and we find the major chord, the 4 notes that we're going to make if we're going to make a full major chord is going to be 1, 3, 5, and then if you want to repeat on the top, 8. All of which are in the Fibonacci sequence and are related via the golden ratio kind of approximations. Even more interesting is if you start counting with 1 and instead go by the chromatic scale, you get 1, 5, 8, and 13 are the same notes. So we got 1, 3, 5, 8, and then 1, 5, 8, and 13. I'm sure you can see a pattern if you're familiar with the Fibonacci sequence. And specifically, if you want some real life analysis, there's this two-page piece of music that I'm holding up because I don't want to have to share my screen. But this is Elliott Carter's Canon for 3, and I wrote my final paper of undergrad on this piece. It's only 26 measures, but if you're familiar with the number 26, that might already stand out to you because there are 2 main sections of this piece. The first section is the first 16 measures, and the second section is the final 10 measures. And if you divide both of those by 2, you get an 8-to-5 relationship. So not only that, within the 8 section, you have a division. So that's 16 bars, right? This section. And you have a division of those 16 bars into 10 measures and 6 measures, which once again divides down to 5 and 3. And if you go to the 5 section, that 5 section divides down to 2 and 3 measures. And so this composer was very specific about including these intrinsic mathematical relationships in their music. And you can both see and hear the large-scale structure of the music and understand how this kind of self-similar geometry makes itself prevalent here. And the coolest part about it is that my whole thesis of this paper that I was writing was that this piece is all about self-similarity. There's symmetry all throughout this piece in many different dimensions. And the piece itself does a really, really cool thing where it essentially imitates itself in a very difficult way that I don't have the time to understand, to explain right now. But it's such a cool piece, and I was looking at it and I was trying to divide it down into different parts, and it popped out right in front of me, and there were golden ratio relationships.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned self-similarity of all things too. The students who are in honors geometry, and maybe some of the others will come and join too. We have one last chance to do some math together next week that we'll be talking about self-similarity and fractal geometry and some of the neat connections with nature and so on. And you just brought up some neat connections in music. So that's definitely something worth exploring. Now, let's take it back to video games a little bit.
Sure.
Okay, so you were talking about some of the video games you worked with and some of your interest in that. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about maybe how you got interested in those, and if were there any video games that you played before? What is it about them, musically speaking, that inspired you to think about them? And is there anything special, different about the music of video games that makes them different from the music you'd hear on the radio?
Well, to answer your second question, I wrote a 70-page paper about it. But in reality, the things that the first part about this is that I grew up playing video games. So all the video games that I played, starting with the Nintendo Entertainment System, released in 1989, I think, I was exposed to essentially the entire development of the home game industry. And I'm very, very grateful for that. And one thing that's very interesting to me about video games is the fact that it's been a process of both artistic change and also technological change. And I think one of the most interesting things about game music is that we, as game composers, are reliant on technology. And so the earliest game composers, they only had 4 channels of sound that they could write with. You couldn't write more than 4 notes at once. It wasn't possible. And so they had to be very, very creative about what sort of music they wrote. As things went on, you start being able to emulate instruments a little bit better, and then start seeing around 2005-ish, or 2000 to 2005-ish CD quality audio on games, where we're actually able to hear live recorded music, which also brings its own issues because, with a program or something that you've written on code, you can make it loop very easily. If you're recording something, you have to find a way to make that loop seamless, and it's a lot harder than it seems. Mm-hmm. So that's a very interesting part of me, is the technological stuff. And I've learned a lot in terms of, like, I've taken programming classes, and I've taken a couple of things that explore the technological side of this. But also, I love the fact that these are melodies that at sometimes will take front and center, right? It'll be the most important thing that you're thinking about. If you're watching a cutscene and there's dramatic music and there's violins playing and it's beautiful, the music could take over your entire, conception of the game. But most of the time, it's in the background. It's going to be something that maybe you don't pay too much attention to while you're playing. But then once you stop, you realize you're humming a song and you're like, what was that again? I really love the fact that it has the opportunity to be both very performative, but also very kind of subtle. And I think the thing that really speaks to me about video games also is the fact that they can be dynamic in ways that other music can't. If you have a pop song that you release, it's a 3.5-minute chunk of music, and it's the same every single time you listen to it. That's one of the beautiful things about music, is that if you have a favorite song, it's the same thing every time. But in games, it can be very different. You can have stuff that changes depending on the actions of the player or the state of the game. And it's, just really, really cool to have music adapt on the fly to whatever you're doing. So part of the thing that I discovered and kind of worked on in my thesis is figuring out how games do that and why that changes the way that game composers think about music as they're composing. And there's been some other music that's tried to do this sort of choose your own adventure style stuff, but I've realized that a lot of it just doesn't do it the same way, and it's not as effective because there's something about the process of playing that is so integral to this music. Ultimately it's led me to this conclusion that, like, I really, really like studying this stuff just as much as I like writing it and being a part of it. So I've got a bunch of books that I've been reading about video game music and video game music, like scholarship. I have 2 professors that I've been working with kind of on the side doing independent research. And hopefully, if depending on where things go, I might end up going to grad school to continue studying game music and how it works.
Mm. Drake, you talked about about looping in the music loops that you write for video games. Mm-hmm. And you started to go down this path. I want to see if you could explore this a little bit more with me here. What is it about the actual thought process of composing a loop of music for a video game? How is it different? What kind of considerations do you have to have in creating something that works, that loops the way that you want?
The best metaphor I've ever heard about this was by Winifred Phillips, who wrote The Composer's Guide to Game Music. The way she views it is, imagine that you're walking, through a trail in the forest with a friend, and you're having a really engaging conversation. This is like one of the best conversations you've ever had. And you're walking around, and it's beautiful outside, and you love it. It's beautiful. After about an hour, you're like, okay, I've definitely seen that tree marker before. Or I've definitely seen that log on it. We've stepped over that log like 3 times now, haven't we? And the idea is that the conversation is so engaging that even though the surroundings are beautiful, you don't notice that you're actually walking in a circle. And so this idea of composing a loop of music, it's one of the most integral things to games. Games have been using loops since the 1980s. And it's really hard to write a good one because you have to make something enjoyable. You have to make it actually sound good. People have to like it. It has to not be annoying enough that, after 30 seconds or a minute of playing the game, you're like, okay, I want this music off. And also it has to be subtle enough that you don't actually really notice that it's looping. And the hard part about it is that most songs, when you're learning to write music, either at a school or just when you're learning to write music, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? It's like any other thing that you have. Loops can't do that. You don't end a loop. It never ends. I've composed myself into a corner once. The first thing that I wrote for these VR friends of mine, I started it, and if you don't know music theory, it's okay. This is just, I started in A minor, and I was like, ooh, okay, I want to do a modulation up to B minor. And I was like, ooh, that sounds really good. And then I have another section. I'm like, okay, we'll go up to C sharp minor. And then I do it again, and I'm an E flat minor. And I realized, oh, I've already written about 2.5 minutes of music. They wanted a 3-minute loop. So I have 30 seconds left, and I have to get from E flat minor to A minor. Those are a tritone apart. That's the farthest away any two musical keys can be. And I wrote the most, I still think of this as some of the most creative 4 bars of music I've ever written, because I managed to get from E flat minor back to A minor in 4 bars without it sounding really weird. And so, if you're like me, you don't think very far ahead, and you end up having to pull something like that. But the people who are doing this, kind of full time, they, are experts at making sure that this is kind of a unified piece, and that it always ends in a way that allows for a seamless transition back in. My favorite story is the guy who wrote the Mario Bros theme. Every time he wrote a new song, he has speakers all throughout his house. He'd play it in his house for 4 hours. And if he was still humming it by the end and he wasn't bored, then he knew it was a good track. Because if he could listen to it for 4 hours and not be bored, then someone who's playing a game for an hour is going to be perfectly fine.
Good. I love when you answer questions that you have this natural tendency to talk in metaphor and jump from one context to another, but you're talking about the same thing throughout. And I think that's really kind of representative of the entire paradigm we're talking about, where basically math describes everything. And you could be talking about music, but you're really talking about math.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool. So there's a question that came in from the audience that I think connects really nicely with that. So here it goes. I think you're going to enjoy this one. Gabby asks, how has seeing math and music in this way changed your view of the world? Do you ever randomly see math and music in your daily life now?
Yes, I 100% do. I went into college not actually knowing much popular music. I didn't really have what I considered my own taste in music. And I developed that all throughout college, and being in an a cappella group helped with that. But I had a friend named Willie, and we lived together my sophomore year. And at some point, he was just starting to get into music, and he had inherited a guitar and a keyboard from his friend or family or whatever. And he's a huge Beatles fan, and he thinks Abbey Road is not Abbey Road. Sorry, he thinks Penny Lane is a perfect song. And I was like, oh, I haven't heard Penny Lane. And he was like, what? And I was like, I just haven't. And he was like, can you explain to me why it's a perfect song? And I was like, I can try. And so we went upstairs. I listened to Penny Lane for the first time, and we sat down at a keyboard, and we spent an hour and a half. I was just describing the things that I heard, just my first instincts. And I ended up coming to some really cool conclusions that I ended up looking up and other people weren't talking about. And it's because I've started getting to a point where every time I'm listening to a piece of music, I'm looking for the little things. I'm looking for the kind of hints that composers and musicians leave for each other as, oh, I'm doing a cool thing right now. And I think ultimately you can look for that in everything. And I think as long as we're focusing, if you're training your brain to pick up on patterns, that's the best thing you can do for yourself, is because picking up on patterns can be something small, like appreciating some geometry and architecture and being like, oh, I understand what's going on there. That's really cool. I think the aha moment of life is one of the best parts of life, is because when you finally realize why something works,
yes,
it's as if you're talking to the person that made it. So for music, for me, whenever I have that aha moment where I understand something, it's like I'm having a conversation with the composer, or if I'm looking at a beautiful piece of architecture, I'm talking to the architect. And all that is that we are training ourselves to recognize these patterns. And so even outside of music, I was taking a walk one day, and I was just, Cornell has a lot of beautiful area, and we have a beautiful botanical gardens. And so I was kind of getting lost in the botanical gardens, and I saw a really interesting leaf. And I was like, I'm going to look at this leaf for a little bit. Not something that you would normally just say, I'm going to look at this leaf for a while, but I was like, this leaf is interesting to me. And I was like, let's figure out what this leaf is about. And it took me a couple of minutes. I was like, why is this so compelling to me? And I was like, oh, I learned about this in Mr. D's class. And I was looking at the fractal and the self-similarity, the geometry of the leaf, because I was like, this is so cool and interesting. And it was like I was talking to the creator of the leaf, whoever that is. So ultimately, I do notice the math in music. I notice the patterns in a lot of the things that I'm doing. And I think every day I'm working harder to try and keep my eyes and ears open to everything that's around me. And if you can notice, one thing that this is so outside of the scope of this, but I'm sure a lot of you are in your homes, and that you've been in for your entire life, or a large portion of your life.
Probably.
Discover something new in your house this week. I've been living in this house that I'm in right now in Ithaca for 2 years, and I've discovered entire new little nooks and crannies and places that I never knew. I've discovered fascinating things about the architecture of this house that I never knew. So find something that you haven't recognized yet, and just pay a lot of attention to it. And I promise you'll find something cool if you look hard enough.
That's perfectly something else I ask you about. It's the people who are now or watching are not students, they actually music students that, of course, we're talking about someone who's a music major, so they're coming in here. And many music students have gone through DV and other schools, okay, wanting to study more music in college, more about it. You majored in music, but it seems that what you're doing is very different than just like expanding your experience playing the viola or something, okay? How can our current high school students or anyone just interested in music access the kind of learning in your own home like you talk about? Like, maybe what is it? Can you train your mind to look at them? Are there certain things you should read? What kind of things can you recommend for them to do to maybe expand their horizons within their interest in music?
Yeah. So one thing that I will always say is that there's so much music you've never listened to, and there's so much music that's nothing like anything you've ever listened to. Yeah. If you look up post-tonal music, you may not like it, but it's different than anything you've ever heard. And I think that's just a cool thing to experience. It's something that's so different from whatever you've ever heard. Doesn't have to be that. If you look up musics of certain cultures outside of the Western tradition, they have some really awesome stuff that a lot of us, have never heard. And I know that growing up in Pennsylvania, I've came to Cornell and I was like, there's all this stuff that I've never heard. And it's one search away. If you go on YouTube or Spotify, you can find essentially whatever you want. But aside from listening to music, I would say one of the really nice things about one of the weird perks of this whole situation that we're in right now is that a lot of libraries are doing kind of free digital access to a lot of books. And one thing that I didn't really even know existed when I graduated high school is the entire field of musicology, which is essentially not necessarily talking about how music works, like music theory, but how music is with culture. How do we use music? I bet you've never really thought about elevator music before. elevator music doesn't really exist anymore. What happened to it? You know, there are people out there asking these questions, and it's not just about elevator music. People will talk about how the rise of punk culture changed the United States, or how rock and roll emerged out of jazz and bebop and all these other traditions. There are people that are talking about music from the 1400s and how we can trace the lineage from music all the way back then to what we listen to today. And there's just the thing I'll say is be curious, but also be entirely aware that there are entire fields of study that you've never heard of, and that if you ever run across one, do a little Wikipedia search. Like all it takes is 5 minutes of reading to be like, oh, that's cool, or I'm not interested in that at all. But if I hadn't kind of stopped and been like, wait, people are actually studying game music? People write about this and publish books about this? I had no clue. And lo and behold, one of the people who did that was like in the building that I study at most frequently. And so I went up to him and I was like, hey, can you talk to me about video game music? And we started doing independent research together. So ultimately, the most powerful resource that we have right now, especially when we're kind of, doing whatever in our rooms, just kind of existing right now in this weird time, we have the internet, and the internet can be used for really boring, inane stuff. And it can also be, listen, I'm not going to talk badly upon Netflix because everybody knows I've watched enough of that. But I'll say, if you're feeling like your days are starting to seem the same, go onto Wikipedia, just see what's there, read about something, find a book that it doesn't have to be a book, find a chapter of something that you want to read, and maybe you'll find something new and interesting. And if not, move on to the next.
Spoken as a true Quiz Bowl player, right? Absolutely. It's just the way you approached it with that too. And like all of our Quiz Bowl players approach it and obviously your influence there is a big help with that too. We're not done with our time yet, but I want to make sure that we get just a quick plug in before we get done with our time. So on Thursday this week, just 2 days from here, we're going to be welcoming another DV alumnus who went through honors geometry and also AP statistics at the school. Greg Giliberti from Penn State, who graduated just a year before you graduated from Cornell, is now a consultant with Deloitte Consulting, even out of his major in statistics at Penn State. He even went on to work with Disney. What would Disney want with a statistician, huh? So you're going to hear more about that. That will be on Thursday here at 12 o'clock, just like this. But let's get it back to Drake here for a moment again and come up with something here toward the end. And you've kind of started to touch on this. Your love of learning comes out clearly in everything you say and the way you say it. What advice, Drake, can you give to today's Delaware Valley High School students as they seek to find direction for themselves? Maybe they don't know where they're going next. They got extra time on their hands right now as they're stuck inside the home. They want to study more or something like that. What is it that you can tell today's student just about maybe finding that path like you are finding your path now?
First of all, before I answer the question, I love this question. I was gonna mention, first of all, Greg and I were in a band together. Yeah. We were in a jazz band together. Join a band is my first bit of advice. Bands are fun. No, okay. First thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is that I know a lot of people in college who have developed themselves for a career, which really, really works if you're going towards one thing. But I also know other people who maybe have a career goal in mind. Maybe they want to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. But it's not like they're developing themselves for the career that they want. And let me explain this. I think that one of the most helpful ways you can think about how you go about learning in life is that you're not developing yourself for a career, you're developing skills. And I say that because if I had known from the very beginning, I'm like, I'm going to be a game music person. I maybe wouldn't have taken programming my freshman year. I maybe wouldn't have taken Python because I took introductory Python because it was a class that I needed for the math major. And I have used my programming knowledge way, way more than I ever thought I would in a musical context. And first of all, just learn to do some computer science, learn to program. It's so useful. Learn Excel. Again, you may not think a musician would have to use Excel that much, but Excel is so useful. It's like among the most useful. There are so many good tutorials that can teach you the basics of how to use Excel very effectively in 30 minutes, an hour. There's so many good resources out there. So I would say develop skills, because ultimately, first of all, you need things to do when you're not doing your work. Like when I'm not doing music, I have things that I can do that I can still be developing myself, but it doesn't mean I have to be working on my music 24/7. That would just drive me crazy. I need things that I can step away from. But also kind of going into the realm of things like hobbies. This is something that I said when Mr. Divisi and I talked last, and I actually really, really love it, and I'm going to keep it as a personal mantra. Your hobbies treat you well, right? Your hobbies bring you joy. They give you something to do. They give you something that you can progress in. You maybe get better at your hobbies. You become more and more involved. You can meet people through your hobbies. Hobbies are great things to have. And whether it's, a really intense hobby, like for me, I was doing a cappella rehearsals and singing, I did 4 to 5 days a week for all of my college career. That's a very intense hobby. Or it could be something that you do on your free time. Maybe you do crosswords every once in a while when you're stressed. So hobbies treat you well. So you should treat your hobbies well. Invest in them in the sense that they are investments in your life. They are ways to, your hobbies are ways to de-stress. Your hobbies are ways to have fun. Your hobbies are ways to better yourself in a way that is not so concrete and strict as I'm getting a job or as I'm developing my career. So treat your hobbies well. Have a couple that you can rely on, and give them the attention they deserve. Don't let your hobbies be lonely. And also realize that great things can come out of your hobbies that you don't even expect. I got really into crosswords my sophomore year of college, and I started, talking to some friends that I knew, and some of them had actually written crosswords, like made New York Times published crosswords before. I was like, oh, that's really cool. How do you do that? So I started looking up some things about that, and I was like, oh, this is really fun. So I downloaded a program, and I was like, oh, let me try toying around with this. And fast forward a couple of years, I've been paid to write a crossword. I had a friend who had me write a crossword for his sister's birthday, and I got $150 from that. It's not as much as most crossword writers get paid, but it's pretty good for a first one. And I'm only saying that because, I just remember that, like, in the end, I don't really care that I got that $150. $150 is a number, right? That's something. But in the end, I am getting rewarded for my hobbies. I am getting rewarded for being engaged with the things that I really like to do. And I find that true for everything that I do. I've recently started this last year getting really into Dungeons and Dragons, and that's like very popular right now, both because of quarantine and because of things like Stranger Things. But now, like, I run, Dungeons and Dragons campaigns for my friends in my house, and it's just a great time that we all get together and have fun for a week, or for 1 day a week. I could list off a million things that I have gotten to enrich my life, but in the end, you got to find what works for you and what does that. And there will usually be interesting side effects, I'm sure you can speak to that about geocaching, Mr. D. There's so many benefits to everything that you might not notice when you first start. so you should treat your hobbies well. That's the thesis statement of all of that.
Excellent. Drake, thank you so much. The time that you spend it sounds like I'm repeating myself from my last two interviews with this, but your enthusiasm for what you love, for what you're talking about, and the way that you talk about it for everybody, I think speaks volumes, and I think is an inspiration to the kids that we have now. Not just the kids, the adults. It speaks to me too. So I love talking with you, Drake, anytime about anything, and it's always an interesting path that the conversation might take.
That's
So,
true.
I'm glad that we have this one recorded so we can have a map of that path that it took here. But thank you so much for being here, Drake, and obviously wish you all the best in what you have coming up. Who knows where that goes? Obviously, video game music is possibly a part of it, but so many directions you can go.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everybody who chimed in to listen today. I'm really happy to kind of have this platform to. This is such a nice way to wrap up college, and I want to say one final thing to the people graduating this year. We're in the same boat. I'm with you. It sucks. I totally understand that, but in 10 years, we're gonna be the people who are coming back and saying, we graduated in a quarantine, so all the other classes can shut up. So really, my heart does go out to you, DD seniors. I hope you got the chance to kind of enjoy your senior year for what it really was, and always keep in touch with your friends from high school, because in the end, you went through this together. And I know that we're in some ways physically separated right now, but I think everybody's going through this together. And as long as we're being conscious about keeping in touch and having things like this, and thank you, Mr. D, for having things like this, I think that's really a testament to your initiative as a teacher. And I really am just, my heart goes out to you, seniors, and I really want to encourage you all to just do with your life what is most rewarding for you. If you feel like you have, I didn't think that through. If you feel rewarded and satisfied with what you're doing, there's no better way to live life. So find what that is for you.
Amen. All right.
Yeah.
Drake Eshelman has been our guest today from Delaware Valley High School and Cornell University. So thanks so much for being here. We'll be back on the air, YouTube Live, on Thursday at 12 noon with Greg Giliberti. In the meantime, thanks, Drake, and you all have a great afternoon.